All right, I am recording. So that way if someone comes in a little bit later, they won't miss out on some of this stuff. Even though it'll be a review of what I did yesterday. So there's a couple things that we'll talk about throughout the through the semester or through the next couple weeks about the reviews, the review sessions that I'm posting or putting together. I try not to do everything all at once. I try to give it to you in chunks, and then right when we're at like week 5, week 6, you should have enough tools where you can go through the whole test or the whole practice or even other practice questions and really be able to answer the questions without well, there's always going to be issues, but hopefully it's reduced issues. I still haven't found out this information, but if anyone knows, type it into the chat. Do you know if your 110 test, first of all, can anyone type into the chat what the date is, and then also type into the chat what the format is, meaning is it pen and paper or pencil and paper, or is it going to be on Blackboard? And if you don't know, you can just say don't know. That's okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, if you don't know, that's okay. Then I'm going to see if I can find that out for you. If I don't, yeah, you won't. There is no drug calc. This is the drug calc stuff. So that it's kind of on your own. You should have been told, you have a test this day or this week, whatever week that is. I think it's at the end of February or beginning of March. And then I would assume that they would tell you to format, but I'll find out for you. So yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you everyone who's chiming in. So I'll find that out for you. If someone would be so kind to email me to remind me if I don't get that information out to you, but I will, I'll at least try and find that out. As a reminder, and again, I'll email, the regular time for these review sessions is going to be Tuesdays at 3 p.m. That should be able to accommodate most everyone. I think except for the people that have clinicals at Presbyterian. If there's another day that would work, I did yesterday at 1 o'clock, and I know that might work for some people, but not everybody. I can try and do 2 sessions a week. But we'll just kind of see how things go. All right. So last time or yesterday when I was discussing this, I mentioned to everyone that you need to know. Okay. Actually, before I get into that, sorry, I always get ahead of myself. So what is this test? So this test that you're going to be taking, it's week 6 or week 7. It's in, I believe, one of your labs. You may only have one lab, and it is a 25 question test. You get 1 hour to complete this 25 question test, and you can miss 2 out of 25. You have to pass it with a 92% or better in order to continue on with 110. What'll happen is if you don't pass the first time, and it happens different, for different variety of different reasons. If you don't pass the first time, you'll do a remediation that might include connecting with me once again via Zoom and talking about what you missed, and then trying to kind of get you back on track with getting the questions right. And then you would take a retake. And as long as you pass that retake, it will be fine. But if you don't pass the retake, then they will, I don't know all the procedure, but apparently they'll withdraw you from 110, and then you'll have to repeat it. So you'll see this dosage calc or drug calc test every semester. However, your first semester approach is the only one that is week 6, week 7. The remaining drug calc tests are actually going to be week 1 right at the beginning of the semester. So for like second semester, you're going to have a test, a drug count test, 25 questions, 1 hour to complete. You can only miss 2. If you miss more than 2, you remediate, retake, and as long as you pass, then you can continue on. And then you'll do that for third and for fourth semester as well. And if you're sitting there getting all stressed out about that, don't get too stressed out, because I'm also here to help out. If you've gone to my YouTube channel, you have seen all of the reviews that I've previously done, and you'll see that I'm continuing to do those reviews. I've even branched out to some of the other campuses, but I have those review sessions usually at the beginning of this, or the week before the semester starts. And I spend, for me, it's all day from noon until 7 on Tuesday and Thursday reviewing for each of the sections. So every section gets 2 hours per day, an afternoon session, and then like a later afternoon session. So there is help. And then now that we have the ability to record and I can upload to YouTube, you don't have to go looking for the Zoom to find it. So anyways, those are the basics. 25 questions, and we'll go through and break down, but the practice test that I put together for you is a good example of what to expect and to prepare for the real thing. So you'll see that. Okay, yeah. So yeah, and then do you happen to know the date for week 6? I know we're in week 3 right now, so let me see here. Okay, yeah. So I actually think it's going to be on, I think your lab is on Tuesdays. My guess is it's going to be on the 28th, because I was anticipating doing a review on the 21st. So we'll see. But that does sound right. Week 6. Sometimes it gets pushed back to week 7. It just depends on how things fall. But that does sound right. Week 6. So we got 3 weeks to go. All right. So know your basic conversions. So these conversions that are written out here, and highlighted, you need to know those. You need to have them memorized, because they will not be given to you on the test. They're expected to know. So when they say convert milligrams to micrograms, convert grams to milligrams, convert teaspoons to milliliters, convert milliliters to ounces, they're expecting that you already know how to do all that. Okay, so you'll hear me reference that. My recommendation is, if you have a hard time remembering these things, is when you sit down to practice this stuff, write down the conversions. These are the ones to know. Okay, if you're at one of the other campuses like Boyce or North or South, they actually have to know pints, cups, quarts. You guys don't need to worry about that. But and then they also need to know centimeters and inches. You don't need to worry about that for Allegheny campus. But these are the ones to focus on. Once you know these, then you can, that's one less thing to worry about. Another thing is you can make flashcards just to make sure you know what they are. But I would just say get in the habit of writing them down. Some of you are going to be able to answer a lot of these questions I'm going to go through just in your head. You're going to answer it. I'm going to walk you through, when you know how to do the easy ones, that usually translates into being able to learn from those easy type of questions. When I say easy, I just mean like basic. You've done it a few times already, and you kind of have a good grasp on it. But what you're going to do is you're going to want to make sure you know how to do these problems, because they're going to get more challenging. I just want to make sure that I show you some strategies that will help you out. Now, somebody asked me, I think they emailed me, or they're asking me about like rounding rules. The rounding rules are here. I will intermix them with the review, but just know that I've written these all down. And if you're wondering, like, where is this dosage calc review intro? It's in that link that says click here for practice tests. You click there, click on Allegheny, click on 110, and you will see all these files that are available for you to download and to reference. Okay, and there's a couple versions. If you want to look around at the other Allegheny practice stuff for the other semesters, you're welcome to do so. But I will tell you that the practice test in the 110 folder is what you want to focus on for preparing for the tests. So there's some things in like next semester, third and fourth, that you are not responsible for yet, but you will get to see them soon enough. Some of you, if you've done this before, or if you're maybe been on YouTube and looking at some of the other practice that's out there, you'll see that ordered or desired over have is a common equation that is very helpful. In fact, majority of the questions you'll be doing in first semester and even into most of second semester can use the ordered over have. It works great. The problem is when you get into starting to talk about flow rates and then converting rates, one rate to a different type of rate, like third and fourth semester, the order over have doesn't work the same way. And so it's also helpful to know other strategies. You don't need to worry about flow rates this semester, at least I don't think so. I did put something like this together, and I'll explain where this came from. This has to do with if you see the question about, a patient voided or urine's output was blah, and then the replacement volume was, blah, what is, or the actual or the expected volume was blah, and the replacement volume is blah. How much would you give them to replenish them to, keep them hydrated? And we'll go through examples of that. We'll probably do that next time. Dimensional analysis is what I predominantly will be utilizing just because it's applicable to everything that we're doing. Even if you hate it, I think the only reason you hate it is just because it was in chemistry, and maybe you struggle with chemistry because there's a lot going on in chemistry. Dimensional analysis is just a strategy for organizing and setting up your problems. That way you can at least see that you've put things and organized it appropriately. A lot of times you're going to be asked or told to show your work. Dimensional analysis is a great way to show your work for two reasons. One, it satisfies the requirement of showing your work. And two, if you miss something, a lot of times your instructor, or if I, and sometimes I'll get access and I can look and see what you wrote down in your test. I can see what you did, and I can give you some guidance on to where you went wrong and how to fix it, so you don't do it again the next time. So it does create that versus like, well, what were you thinking here? I don't remember. I just answered the question. And I was like, okay, well, how did you answer this question? And then I have to kind of figure out how you're organizing the question. But don't worry, I'm really good at what I do. And I can, even via Zoom, even without being able to see you, I can get you to explain to me how you set up a problem, and I can help navigate you. All right, textbook resources. These are just some textbooks. If you don't need to buy these or anything like that, but these are what I utilized many years ago to put together some of these practice sets. And that was prior to having better access to better material, but it still holds up. So, all right. Any questions on the format of the test? All right. All right, so let me switch my share. I'm going to pull up the practice test. So like I said, this is a mock test. It's not the actual test you're going to see or anything like that. And you'll notice that I already wrote a bunch of stuff in here. I'm going to rewrite these things. But I wrote these things, like I said, on Wednesday, yesterday. So let me go through and let me delete what I wrote. I'm going to leave a few things up because they're still hold up, but I'll show you my work and why that's important. A different example. All right, so a couple things. The first thing is the first few, like we'll just say the first 5 or so questions are going to be what are considered your basic conversion questions. When they say basic conversion questions, they mean converting from one unit within the metric system to another unit within the metric system. So the examples that I had written here is milligrams to grams or micrograms to milligrams. And then I drew a double arrow just to indicate and vice versa. So you need to know how to go from milligrams to grams. You need to know how to go from grams to milligrams. Okay. So that's where that knowing your numbers becomes helpful. Now, because on Wednesday I did the grams to milligrams, I'm going to actually jump down to the one I didn't do on Wednesday, which is the micrograms to milligrams, and then I'll give you the reverse. That way we can see. So I'll try and do some of these questions that we didn't do on Wednesday. That way this review is a little bit different than what we saw. There we go. That helps to clear up a little bit. The other type of conversion that we'll get is what's called, oh, I thought that would clear up for me. Let me see if I can move this down. There we go. The other type of conversion setup we'll get is called the metric to household conversion. So metric to household means you have the metric system, milligrams, micrograms, grams, milliliters, liters, and household are things that you would use in the house: teaspoons, tablespoons, pounds, gallons, if we were talking about that, cups, pints, quarts. Those are all considered household measurements or household units. So you'll go from metric to household. You need to know how to go from metric to household, but you also need to know, more importantly, I think, in reverse, because most people are going to make that they're going to tell you something like, oh, I drink 4 cups of water a day. Well, what does that translate into milliliter wise or liter wise? Or patient says, I weigh 178 pounds. Okay, well, what does that translate into in kilograms? Because some medications are weight-based medications, meaning that they will tell you, okay, you take the patient's weight in kilograms, and then they're going to receive so many milligrams per kilogram body weight. So you need to know their kilograms, and you need to account for their body weight. So some things are going to incorporate that, some things are not. Okay. So what are some examples? Well, going from milliliters to ounces or ounces to milliliters, like I have written here. Going from milliliters to tablespoons or teaspoons and vice versa. So just a shorthand, big T is tablespoon, but usually it's going to be written out as big T, little b, little s, little p. And then teaspoon is little t, which will usually be abbreviated little t, little s, little p. So just something in case you see that. Going from kilograms to pounds, and probably more importantly, going from pounds to kilograms. So now I also added a little asterisk here, a little star, where I said that when you're doing metric to metric conversions, you should not be rounding your answers for that. Those should be a whole answer. Do not round that answer. Okay. And I'll show you, I'll give you examples. When you're going from metric to household, you might need to round. So it's okay to round that particular arrangement. And the example I always like to use is if someone's 178 pounds, you make that conversion, that might equal 60 something point whatever pounds. You would then round and follow your rounding rules, which is a number greater than 1, round to the nearest tenth. So I'll emphasize that. We'll talk about that. You'll hear that referenced a lot, but a lot of times students will miss because they forgot that when you go from metric to metric, you don't round, but everywhere else you kind of you can follow the rounding rules. My hope is that I'll say it enough that it'll start to stick and you'll kind of see what they want you to do. I like to tell you there's one hard rule that works, but unfortunately it's still trying to figure out how to answer that or say that question most appropriately. All right, so get rid of that. All right, so last time I did not do the 250 ml to liters, so I'm going to do that. I'm just clearing out some of these things. Oh, nope. Someone asked about calculator use, and I forgot. I didn't say it, but yeah, you get access to a 10 key calculator. So they're going to give you a basic 10 key calculator to use on the test. So yeah, you'll have access to that, which is good. Okay, so for this first one, if you just look at this and you say, okay, I know the answer, it's 0.25. Perfect. That is the right answer. Now, if you don't look at that and know that right off the top of your head, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. So let's work through how we get to that answer. There's a couple of ways. If you remember your base 10 and moving decimal, that's one way you can do things. So I can take my decimal and I can move it 3 to the left. Okay. And that's one way that you can get to that answer. Now, most students, you know, regardless of their background, forget about some of the aspects of rounding or how to move, you know, their base 10 and how to do all that kind of stuff. So that's where dimensional analysis comes into play. And then here with these more straightforward type questions, I think are usually a good place to practice that. So even if you hate doing dimensional analysis, I would recommend just trying it out. So what I'm going to do is, in order to do dimensional analysis, is I'm going to take the given, the 250 milliliters, and I'm going to put it over 1. And then I'm going to create a conversion factor where my goal is to convert milliliters to liters. Now, one of your things that you need to know is that 1 liter contains 1,000 milliliters. You need to know that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put what I don't want so I can cancel it out. I'm going to put what I do want, what I want to be left with. And then before I put any numbers, okay, I just make sure that my units are in the right positions. They cancel out. So milliliters cancels out. I'm left with liters. And then I put in my conversion factor. What is it? 1 liter is equal to 1,000 milliliters. So if you ever get stuck, or sometimes you answer this question and you write 2.5, 25, 2500000 because you moved it all the way in the complete opposite direction of that you're supposed to go, then this will help to anchor you and ground you into what types of questions you should be or what type of answers you should be working towards. Then you just plug it into your calculator. 250 times 1 is 250. 1 times 1,000 is 1,000. So 250 over 1,000 will give you 0.25 liters. Let's look at the reverse of that. Let's say it told you that you have, let's say, you have 1.5 liters. And you want to know how many milliliters that is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the same strategy. Now, first of all, if you look at that and you say, okay, I'm going to move it 3 to the right, it's 1,500 milliliters, you are correct. But if you're not doing that and you're not entirely sure about that, let's write it out. I'm going to take what I've given, the 1.5 liters over 1. I'm going to set up a conversion factor. So the first thing is do I know a conversion factor to go from liters to milliliters? Yes, I do. Okay. So the next question to ask is, well, what am I trying to get rid of? Okay. I'm trying to get rid of liters. So that's what tells you where liters goes. And I want milliliters. That tells you where milliliters goes. We're looking for milliliters. We don't want liters. We know that 1 liter is 1,000 milliliters. And that is how you would set that up to get to your answer of 1,500 milliliters. Again, if you're sitting there going like, why is he spending so much time on these? It's the easy ones that you want to work on fine tuning your approach to these things, because when they get a little bit more challenging, it's harder to kind of figure out, like, what do I do? What do I do? I always say, if you go back to the basics, and I always ask when someone tells me, I keep getting this question wrong, how do I do this? And then I'll ask, tell me what you're doing. What are you trying to do, so I can help you? And if I know that, and then I figure out the questions, and I say, okay, yeah, you're doing this, and this is how I would set it up, and this might make sense if you set it up that way as well. All right. Let me go I'm going to come back to the pounds, but I said I would do this one here. So first of all, I'll just ask you, since I haven't gone through this one yet. Go ahead. I want you to take a moment. Tell me what you think the answer is to this question, and then just type it into the chat. Wrong answers are welcome. I should also ask that I'll accept I don't know. And if you don't want to say I don't know to everyone, you can just send it to me as a direct message. I will not call you out. All right. Well, it looks like the consensus is what is the correct answer, which is that 0.025 milligrams. I put this question on here because the common thing is to try and round that to like 0.03. Don't do that. You don't round basic metric to metric conversions. And then this question is clearly a basic metric to metric conversion, going from micrograms to milligrams. So let's say you didn't know how to answer this question. Let's set it up using our good friend dimensional analysis. I'm going to start off with 25 micrograms. I'm going to set up a conversion factor. What am I converting? I'm converting micrograms to milligrams. Do we know that conversion? Yes, it's one of the ones you have to know. 1 milligram is equivalent to 1,000 micrograms. You're going to see a trend here. 1 liter is 1,000 milliliters, 1 gram is 1,000 milligrams, and 1 milligram is 1,000 micrograms. So if you remember 1,000, you're probably on the right track. Okay. So, but before I put any numbers anywhere, I always make sure I put what I'm trying to get rid of and what I'm looking for, and I arrange them appropriately. I want to make sure what I'm looking for is in the right spot. Okay. Because I'm looking for milligrams. I'm trying to get rid of micrograms. So before I put any numbers, then you can sit there and go, oh, was it my conversion? 1 milligram, 1,000 micrograms. And that's where you get 25 divided by 1,000 and you get 0.025. That's supposed to be a decimal here. Let's see if I can shade that in a little bit better. There we go. Good. Those of you got that really good. All right. So that's metric to metric. Most metric to metric conversions are going to be mass based. So milligrams to grams, grams to milligrams, micrograms to milligrams, milligrams to micrograms, and then milliliters to liters, liters to milliliters. I should also add that in the event that you see milliliters, or if you see CC, like cubic centimeters, CC, 1 CC equals 1 ml. They're the same thing. Okay. So if you've ever been watching like your favorite medical comedy or drama and they said, I need 100 cc's of whatever stat, cc's means the same thing as ml. So now you know, just in case you didn't. All right. I worked through these last time and I gave some examples just working back and forth. So milliliters to ounces, ounces to milliliters. But I did want to work through the pounds again. Okay. So I had written here previously, but I'll rewrite it. 1 pound or 1 kilogram is equal to 2.2 pounds. And if you don't believe me, the next time you go to the gym, look at the weights. Some weights are in kilograms, and then it'll tell you the pounds. So 1 kilogram plate is 2.2 pounds. And then sometimes they'll tell you the pounds, like 2.5 pounds. And then it'll say like it's like 1 point something kilograms. Okay. So you can look at that and see that. Some of you are like, I don't have time to go to the gym. I'm in nursing school. I understand that. Okay. So what we're going to do is the most direct way to answer these pounds to kilograms questions is just to take the patient's weight in pounds, divide by 2.2, and that'll be your kilograms. But sometimes it's helpful to visualize it because every now and then someone will take the patient's weight in pounds, multiply by 2.2, and then now you have a wrong kilogram. Okay. So a way to kind of wrap your head around this too is your body weight in kilograms is about half your body weight in pounds. Okay. So the weight's the same. It's just the system is different. And it's the reverse for measurement. So how tall you are in feet, you're actually much taller in centimeters. Okay. So, or inches and centimeters is probably a better correlation. All right. So it makes you, the metric system makes you tall and thin. All right. So I'm going to set this up using my dimensional analysis rules that we've been practicing here. Take my 128-pound patient. And then I don't want pounds, I want kilograms. Now I have to add, the only way this works is if you know a conversion. So like I couldn't do like pounds to liters. Okay. I mean, that might exist. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but we can't just correlate, pounds to liters. It's you need to know what the conversion factor is in order to do it. Also, if for some reason you go from grams to micrograms, that might involve steps if you don't know what the difference is between grams and micrograms is. Okay. It's actually 1 million. So we mentioned 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds. Cross out pounds. And then this is where we're going to introduce rounding, because when I take 128 divided by 2.2, I'm going to get 58.181818, and it just keeps repeating. So 58.1818, and I'll just say that's repeating. So when you get a number like that, and that's usually like what's obvious, is with the repeating decimals and things like that, that's where you're going to apply your rounding rules. The reason we're going to apply our rounding rules on this question and why we didn't on the other question is this is a metric to household conversion. Actually, it's a household to metric conversion. You might need to round for metric to household conversions, okay, or household to metric conversions. You do not round when you're going metric to metric because you probably won't need to. It'll just be like a very small number like that 0.025 that we saw. So what I'm going to do is the rounding rule states that when you round, you're going to any number greater than 1 round to the nearest 10th. Any number greater than or less than 1, so 0 point whatever, round to the nearest 100th. So for this example, I'm actually going to round this answer to 58.2. Okay, so 58.2 kilograms is what I'm going to round the answer to. As an example, if for some reason you got an answer that was like, 0.125, we'll just say kilograms just to kind of keep it distinct, and you're supposed to round this, you would not round to the nearest 10th. You'd actually round to the nearest 100th. So this would get rounded to 0.13 kilograms. Again, that would be if it came from some sort of pound. So pound to kilogram, whatever that pound happens to be. And you could just take 0.125 times 2.2, and that would tell you what that is. But actually, let me just do that real quick. That way you can see what number that is. Oh, okay. So if we were measuring something that weighed 0.275 pounds, okay. And again, this is just a hypothetical. It's not a realistic question, but 0.275 pounds to become 0.125 kilograms. And then you would round that answer to 0.0 or 0.13 kilograms. You'll see better examples of that as we go through the rest of these review sessions, but I just figured I'd give you that. Let me give you another example. Let's say somebody is 176 pounds. What is their body weight in kilograms? And then go ahead and just put your answer in the chat. You can also just write, I don't know. And if you don't want to share your answer with everyone, you can just send it to me as a direct message. To answer your question, Kelly, yes, the rest of this will be on YouTube. Okay, so if you didn't answer, or if you're not sure, the answers that you saw in the chat are correct. 80 kilograms is the correct answer. And all I did was take 176 divided by 2.2, and that gave me 80 kilograms. For practice purposes, practice doing dimensional analysis. So 176 pounds over 1 times my conversion factor. I'm converting from pounds to kilograms. So that cancels out pounds. I'm left with kilograms, which is what I'm looking for. 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. Okay. And that's just a good shorthand way to remember. I mean, obviously it's longhand because I'm writing this out, but if you ever get stuck, am I supposed to multiply or divide? Write it out. Okay. And if you ever get stuck and you feel like you're always putting things in the wrong places, that's a great thing to share with me. You can even send me a screenshot or take a picture and email it to me. Show me what you're trying to do, and I'll try my best to help you to get it right. Okay. All right. So between yesterday's review and today's review, we've covered some basic conversion factors. I'll do my best to get you some additional ones. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start and introduce the next phase of things. And like I said, I'll recap this on next week on Tuesday, but I'm going to start talking about the labels. And I'm going to start talking about how we do these things, these medications. So I would say for the most part, or at least from, getting feedback from students, the labeled medications and figuring out what to deliver medication wise seems to be a little bit more straightforward. You don't need to memorize anything other than occasionally you might need to know how to convert your metric system factors. But other than that, you shouldn't, it should be pretty straightforward. Anyways, so we're going to look at a couple things. So the first thing I want to look at with this question number 7 is what the label looks like. Okay. So a couple of things you want to look at when you're looking at a label. You want to look at and see, first of all, what is the medication? So for dosage calc, you don't need to worry about what the medication is or how it works or anything like that. You need to know that for like when you do your your pharmacy class. You need to know about that for your other classes. Clinically, you need to know how these things work, their actions. But for drug calculation, we just need to know how to answer the question. And a lot of times for these medications, it's just how much are we administering given the order that's been given. So like it'll say an order of blah has been given or received, and this is what you have available. How much do you give them? Okay. So the first thing is when you're looking at this, especially for things, I imagine like ATI NCLEX might throw out these types of questions where they'll try and trick you by asking you about an ordered medication, and then they'll give you like an order, or they'll give you an available that's not what was ordered. And so you need to be, on the ball, making sure you're not giving them the wrong medication. So step 1, make sure you're looking at the medication. So you can see, it doesn't even say, it just says your patient receives 500 milligrams. So we're assuming it's this, but a lot of times it'll say your patient is to receive 500 milligrams cephalexin, and then it'll say some of the other stuff here. The other thing we needed to look at is how is this medication available? So it's available. The whole bottle contains 100 capsules. So this tells you that this medication is in a capsuled form. That's important to know because if you know about cephalexin is an antibiotic. Antibiotics can be given in capsulated form as well as in liquid form. Both are oral medications, but one would be delivered via mLs and one would be delivered via capsules. And so you do need to pay attention to what that is. A lot of times the context of the question and what's being asked, it'll all make sense. But if you're not paying attention to that, that sometimes can be the thing that, might trip you up. But when you're looking at the label, the thing you want to pay attention to is the name, which is very big. And then how is it administered? Capsules. In the off chance you get a question like on the NCLEX or ATI, and it doesn't say how much, it just says how much would you give the patient, and it doesn't tell you what it's looking for. It's helpful to know that the label basically tells you how it's being administered: capsules, milliliters, etc., tablets, whatever it happens to be. The other thing you want to pay attention to is your labels are going to indicate the strength of the medication. Okay. That is basically your conversion factor. So for like this available, what's available is a 250 milligrams, and that's per 1 capsule. I'm just going to abbreviate that cap. Okay. Now I can flip that however I want to, but that's my relationship. 1 capsule is 250 milligrams. So it might even be better if I write it like this: 1 capsule is 250 milligrams. Sometimes people get hung up like this is the only way it can go. It can actually go, you can alternate which one's on top and which one's on bottom when you are doing your dimensional analysis. So that's part 1, looking at the label. And there's a variety of labels that we'll look at. The next thing is being able to figure out what is being told to you with some of these abbreviations. Okay. So the first abbreviation that's listed here is PO. PO stands for per oral, which just means by mouth, which means you're not going to stick the capsule somewhere else other than the mouth, right? BID, I'm sure it has a more clinical term and I just can't think of it right now, but basically it just means 2 times per day. Or you could say twice per day, or you could say every 12 hours because 12 hours occurs twice per day. There is, I believe there's, I want to say it's if it's not on Blackboard, it might actually be on my the review or the review section where it'll talk about the different types of abbreviations to make sure you know what those are. So for this question, if I'm setting this up using and utilizing dimensional analysis, I'm going to start with my order, which is the 500 milligrams over 1. I'm going to look for my conversion factor because it won't be given to me. But if you ever get stuck, what are you trying to get rid of? Milligrams. What are you trying to convert it to? Capsules. And we know that 1 capsule is the equivalent of 250 milligrams. So per dose, I'm going to give 500 divided by 250. I'm going to give 2 capsules per dose. But this question says, how much am I going to give per day? That's the other thing you got to pay attention to. If we're going to give two capsules twice a day, the answer to this question is actually 4. 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening, 4 capsules a day. If that said you'll give how many capsules, you would just assume per dose. If it said how many capsules per dose, you would just write 2. But since the question asked how many per day, you could say 4. I could also say, we could say 500 milligrams PO BID for 10 days. Okay. Then you might want to know, well, how many will I need for those 10 days? So you would just take 4 per day times 10. You would need 40 for that 10-day supply. And the reason that's important is the pharmacy is going to be, doling out the quantity that is needed, and you want to make sure that if you happen to be in that capacity or you're trying to get enough out for the patient that they're bringing it home, that's what I'm assuming, that there's enough for them to continue and to take the medication. Let me look at another capsule if I can find one. Okay, here's another one. Tagamet. Okay. Now sometimes you'll see where it'll say the order is, you can see up here, the order is cimetidine. Get my pencil right. The order is cimetidine, and then it says Tagamet, but you can also see below cimetidine. So it must be the generic name for, and Tagamet is the brand name. So it's the same medication. What's it available in? It's available in tablets. What's the strength? 400 milligrams. Okay, so these are good questions to ask until you get very comfortable with these. Now, for this particular question, you're going to see that the order is 0.8 grams. PO, again, remember that means by mouth, and then it says QID. QID means 4 times per day. So 4 per day. This is actually only asking how much we're going to give per dose. So we don't really care about the QID, but it's good to know what that means. The other thing to keep in mind is 4 times a day. That means every 6 hours, because 6 times 4 is 24. All right. So how are we going to set this up? The first thing we need to do is my orders or my availables in milligrams and my orders in grams. So I need to convert milligrams to grams or grams to milligrams. So step 1, so this is actually a 2-part question. Step 1 is I need to convert grams to milligrams. Now, if you're like me, you can just say it's 800 milligrams, but if you need the extra practice, okay, sometimes it's helpful just to set it up, just to make sure you're doing everything right. Now that you have the 800 milligrams, now you can factor that into your equation. I don't want milligrams. I want to get rid of milligrams, and I want capsule or tablets. Sorry. One tablet is 400 milligrams. So this patient will receive 2 tablets per dose. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is just review some of these things that we talked about, work through, practice some of these questions. If you want to create some new questions, you're welcome to do so. I will continue to try and create new questions as we work through some of these. But now you've looked at labels, you've looked at trying to solve some of those. You looked at metric to metric conversions, and you looked at metric to household conversions. And so the next thing that we'll look at is we'll continue on with looking at the labels, reading the orders, and then we'll introduce oral suspensions. So, and then you'll see that anytime you see these medications that have like per 5 ml or something like that, that's an indication that it's an oral based medication. So we'll talk about those. So that's a good place to stop for today. Are there any questions before we sign off? Yep, you're welcome. Yeah, if yeah, again, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me. And if I don't hear from you via email, I hope you have a great weekend.